Good evening, I'm Michael Moore. I hope I don't disappoint with those who expected someone else. At any rate, I am very happy to be here tonight and to be in such distinguished company. Three very interesting writers. I spent a great week last week reading under pressure all of their works. I advise you to do the same. I mean, sometimes that's what it takes to pick up a book and read it. And believe me, it's worth it. I wanted to begin by thanking the Center for Fiction for their hospitality tonight and for their openness to literature in translation, a field I'm very interested in myself as the chair of the PEN Translation Fund, where we provide grant money to translators from all the languages in the world and from every era in history in order to encourage their publication in English. I wanted to also thank the 9 cultural institutes. This is what the European literature, new literature from Europe is now entering its 10th anniversary. It started off as a cooperative effort among 5 cultural institutes here, and it has grown to include 9, which are Austria. I tried to memorize them, but it's a long list: Austria, the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Poland, Romania, and Spain. And also we have the support of the New York Public Library, the McNally-Jackson Bookstore, In Translation, which is an insert of the Brooklyn Rail, and the online magazine Words Without Borders. But mainly I wanted to congratulate the organizers of the event for the courage that they showed. Sometimes the idea of a cultural institute inviting one of its writers to this country is tantamount to promoting a kind of cultural diplomacy of sorts for their own country. And instead, this year, and under the theme In Transit, they've invited writers with a broad vision of the world, a strong attachment to places other than their home countries and to languages other than their mother tongue, as well as writers who have a very sharp critique of their homes. In their lives and in their writings, tonight's writers defy simplistic notions about what it means to be holding the passport of any one country. It does not dictate where these writers live, what they write about, or even necessarily the language in which they write, or the literary traditions to which they refer. The other events in this series this week are tomorrow, the Cab Chat at the Melville House bookstore in Dumbo, and on Saturday at the New York Public Library at 5th Avenue and 42nd Street at 2:30, there will be 2 panel discussions about literature and politics. The books by the authors that you are reading tonight are on sale downstairs. Again, I highly recommend that you pick them up, because unless you support writers by buying the books, it's just a kind of moral support, and I'd like a little bit more than that. Very short introductions. Sabine Gruber, certainly, they will now read after me. First, Sabine will read, then she will be followed by Witold Szablowski from Poland, and finally, Ilija Trojanow from Germany. Sabine is sort of born into a place between borders, at the intersection of 2 cultures, Italy and Germany, in an area that some people call Südtirol and others call Alto Adige. A German-speaking area that was subject to Italianization under Mussolini and even after World War II, with the terrible standardizing impulses that terrible conflict brought in its wake. And an area which is subject actually to a very long dispute involving linguistic rights at the United Nations. Her books include actually the book that is being presented tonight, Roman Elegy, whose original title in German was Stilbach, Oder die Sehnsucht. She will be followed by Witold Szablowski from Poland, a graduate of the Department of Journalism and Political Science at Warsaw University. He has also studied political science in Istanbul, where he got to know Turkey inside out. And the book that he is presenting tonight, under the title The Assassin from Apricot City, is a collection of essays that he's written about Turkey, starting actually from the most recent events, the Gezi Square events that you might all have read about this past summer. And finally, Ilija Trojanow was born in Bulgaria, but then traveling through Yugoslavia, I believe, and Italy, ended up with his family in Germany, where they received political asylum, and then moved to Africa, to Nigeria. He was a specialist in African literature. He moved eventually to India, and the focus of his, where he wrote important travelogues, he wrote books about the Ganges, he wrote what's best known in the United States, probably the book that you have on sale downstairs, a book about Sir Richard Burton, the great, I like to think of him as the great translator of the 1,001 Nights, but also the first Westerner to enter the Mecca, as well as the translator of the Kama Sutra, whose pages we shall never see since apparently his wife burned them after his death. But today the book he will be talking about is Ice Tau, whose English title is Ice Thaw. I would now like to ask the writers one by one, first Sabine, followed by Witold, followed by Ilija, to take the floor for a brief reading, for the readings, but before their readings, a very short reading of my own, not something that I wrote, but something that I think captured the themes of identity that are so much at the heart of what we're of the theme of this year's festival. From a book called Twice a Stranger, which begins with the sentence, "We are all children of Lausanne." The Lausanne Convention being the treaty by which Greece and Turkey agreed upon a massive exchange of population on the basis of ethnic identity. And this one passage talks about what a dangerous, fragile, and faulty notion ethnic identity and national identity is. To understand this, it may help to consider the situation which can still be faced by an individual who does risk falling into a gray area between the two governments, Greece and Turkey, despite their best efforts to prevent this. It is a hypothetical case, but a composite drawn from many different real-life stories. Let us call him Kenan, and imagine that he was born around 1970 in a village near the town of Xanthi, one of the two main population centers of Greek Thrace. Like most Muslims in his community, he grew up speaking Pomak so he can understand Bulgarian. He cannot read or write Pomak because that language has no standard written form. At his primary school, one of several hundred minority schools which the Greek government provides under the terms of the Lausanne Treaty, he was taught both Greek and Turkish very badly. This made it very difficult for him to receive any secondary education. His Greek was not good enough to attend a state high school, and his family could not afford to send him to either of the two Turkish-oriented private schools in the region. The only chance of getting a secondary education was to go to Turkey, board with cousins there, and attend a state school. So he completed his schooling and eventually his university education in Istanbul. By staying so long in Turkey, he risked forfeiting his Greek citizenship, so he returned to Greece and did his military service in the Greek army, where Muslim soldiers usually get the dirtiest jobs, just as ethnic Greeks do in the Turkish army. Returning to his native Thrace, he found the politics of his home village were in ferment. There was one faction encouraged by the Greek government which was strongly urging the Pomaks to maintain their Slavic form of speech and distance themselves from their Turkish-speaking co-religionists. Then there was another faction discreetly fostered by the Ankara government, which took the opposite view. Even though Turkish was not their mother tongue, all Pomaks must insist on the right to style themselves as Turks and only Turks. So Kenan has, all of his life, found himself in the middle of a tug-of-war between two governments. I'll leave it at that. Sabine, please.
So Sabine asked me to explain a little bit of the situation that the scene that she is going to read from briefly in German, and then I follow in English a little bit longer. And okay, it is an important moment in the book. One of the protagonists, Emma Manente, is forced to confront her own history when Sandro Pertini, a former partisan, is elected as the new Prime Minister of Italy. Her former fiancé had been killed in 1944 in a partisan attack on the Wehrmacht regiment Bozen, right in the middle of Rome. In the summer of 1978, Emma suffers a kind of nervous breakdown. The past is catching up with her finally. She has fallen in love with a regular guest who's staying in her hotel, and while she secretly inspects his room on a very hot day, she faints and he enters the room unexpectedly. While she is in that somnambulous state, she imagines the death of her former fiancé, Johann. The partisan attack that he was involved with provoked the Germans to commit the greatest massacre on Italian soil. 335 Italians, many Jews among them, were shot in the Adriatic Capes, and a certain Mr. Priebke was one of the commanders in charge. This gentleman has recently been in the news. He just died at the age of 100 after a life mostly spent in Argentina in hiding. And so his death caused all kinds of difficulties because nobody wanted his corpse, and he was finally buried in a prison cemetery. And yeah, okay, so now you.
Emma hatte jetzt Johann vor sich. Er marschierte im Gleichschritt mit all den anderen Rekruten durch die Via del Babuino. Doch über ihm die Fenster in den Häusern waren verschlossen, die Balkone menschenleer. Es gab auch keine Fahnen zu sehen, keine Mädchen, die begeistert winkten. Emma betrachtete seinen erhobenen Kopf, den hellen Schimmer seiner Haut, seinen Mund, der sich im Gleichtakt mit den anderen Mündern öffnete und wieder schloss. Sie sah ihren Johann singen, denn die Deutschen hatten auf dem Weg in die Kaserne immer gesungen. Sie hatten singen müssen, weil ein gewisser Leutnant Wohlgast, der hinter seinem Rücken Leutnant Vollgas genannt worden war, darauf bestanden hatte, dass sie sangen. Johann trällerte jetzt mit all den anderen zu den auf das Kopfsteinpflaster trommelnden Stiefelabsätzen "Hüpf, mein Mädel". Dabei war er doch unmusikalisch, hatte in der Stillbacher Kirche nur lautlos den Mund bewegt. Emma sah lauter Chormünder vor sich und mitten unter diesen aufgerissenen Mündern jenen Johanns. Ob sie wollte oder nicht, sie konnte den Ablauf der Bilder nicht stoppen. Im nächsten Moment schon war Johann ein anderer Mann, den sie an den Schultern packte. Der sie an den Schultern packte. Kommen Sie, ich helfe Ihnen. Doch Emma hatte noch immer die Rekruten vor Augen, die auf den Tunnel, der durch einen der 7 Hügel gebaut worden war, zugingen, auf dieses Loch mitten in der Stadt, das Emma immer von neuem an die unverputzten Felstunnel der Bergstraße erinnerte, die über Stillbach hinausführt. Sie verstand nicht, woher diese Bilder rührten, die den Geliebten zeigten, und mit ihm all die anderen singenden Männer mit dem Maschinengewehr im Anschlag, die sich nicht mehr aufhalten ließen, der unter Führung des Quirinalspalastes immer näher kamen, auf diese Fluchtlücke mitten in der Stadt zusteuerten, in der die Obdachlosen und Ausgebombten saßen und nicht weiter wussten. Und auch Emma wusste in diesem Augenblick nicht mehr weiter, denn sie sah etwas, das sie damals, als es passiert war, gar nicht zu sehen bekommen hatte. Sie sah die Männer vor dem Tunnel links in die enge, leicht ansteigende Via Rasella abbiegen, in der nur ein Müllwagen auf sie wartete und ein Straßenkehrer. Mit den Rekruten bewegte sich jetzt ihr Johann, der vielleicht an nichts anderes dachte als an den Feierabend, an das Ende der Ausbildung und den bevorstehenden Wachwechsel mit den Soldaten der 10. Kompanie. an die neuen Kontrollaufgaben, die ihn erwarteten, der sich vielleicht sagte, es dauert nicht mehr lange, nur noch die Via Rasella hinauf und am Ende der Straße nach rechts weiter in die Via delle Quattro Fontane bis zur Viminale-Kaserne des Innenministeriums, der bestimmt an sie dachte, an seine Emma, an das nächste gemeinsame Treffen in der Anima und an die Rückkehr nach Stillbach irgendwann, wenn die Deutschen endlich in der offenen Stadt für Ruhe und Ordnung gesorgt und die Kommunisten ausgeschaltet hatten.
Emma had the image of Johann before her now. He was marching in step with all the other recruits along the Via del Babugno, but overhead all the windows were shuttered and the balconies empty of onlookers. Nor were there any flags to be seen or girls eagerly waving. Emma could see his head held proudly high, and his fair complexion, and his mouth opening and closing in unison with the rest. Yes, that was her Johann singing all right. The German troops always sang on their way back to the barracks, or rather that Lieutenant Wolgast, who they called Lieutenant Vollgas behind his back, ordered them to sing. So there was Johann, belting out the song "Turn, My Darling" with all the others, in time to the steady crunch of their boots on the cobblestones. For all that, he was completely unmusical. In church in Stillbach, he'd just gone through the motions of singing, silently miming the words. All Emma could see before her now were choir boys' mouths, and among those wide-open orifices, Johann's mouth too. Involuntarily, she seemed unable to stop the images flickering past. In the very next instant, Johann had turned into someone else and was grasping her by the shoulders. "Come along, I'll help you up." But a vivid picture of the recruits still floated before Emma's eyes as they approached the tunnel that had been drilled through one of Rome's 7 hills towards that gaping hole in the middle of the city, which reminded Emma anew of the rough-hewn tunnels through the hillsides on the mountain road above Stillbach. She didn't understand where these images came from, showing her fiancé and all his singing comrades with their machine pistols at the ready as they marched relentlessly onward, all the while getting closer and closer to the underpath beneath the Crenelk Palace, this bolt hole right in the heart of the city, where the homeless and people who had been bombed out of their houses took refuge for want of anywhere else to go. And in that moment, Emma too was at a loss what to do next, for she had seen something which of course she hadn't actually seen on the day it happened. The soldiers wheeling left just before the mouth of the tunnel into the narrow, gently rising Via Rasella, where only a rubbish cart and a road sweeper were standing. And in the midst of the recruits tramped her Johann, who probably had nothing on his mind except his imminent leave, the end of his training, and the handover to the troops of 10 Company. He'd have been wondering about his new guard duties and perhaps thinking to himself, "Not long now, just up the Via Rasella and at the end of the street right into Via delle Quattro Fontane, as far as the Interior Ministry Viminale Barracks, and no doubt daydreaming of her, his Emma, and their next tryst at the Anima, and going back to Stillbach one day when the Germans had finally managed to bring law and order to this open city and finish off the communists." It was warm. Wearing his steel helmet and his heavy munitions belt, Johann must have been sweating, just like Emma was sweating now. What should she do? Not daring to open her eyes, she quickly ushered her Johann, "Turn, my darling," out of the ranks of his fellow soldiers and into the tunnel, so he could emerge at the far end, safe and sound. "It's nothing, really," Emma heard herself say. Clutching the proffered hand, she pulled herself up into a sitting position. "Should I call an ambulance?" Steg pressed his palm to her forehead for a moment. "Well, you don't seem too feverish, at least."
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The yellow and white ferry whizzes, groans, spits a cloud of smoke into the sky, and moves on, and moves off. We are sailing from Europe to Asia. The journey takes about a quarter of an hour. Here there are businessmen along with beggars, women in chadors with women in miniskirts, non-believers with imams, prostitutes with dervishes, the holy with the unholy, all Turkey on a single ferry. The captains of these giants are the modern-day Charons, says Typhoon, a poet friend of mine from Istanbul. Why? Because the journey across the Bosphorus is both beautiful and alarming, like death. In fact, the Charons are cool professionals. Otherwise, their job would be impossible. The Bosphorus is very narrow, in some places barely a few hundred meters wide, but there are thousands of boats and ships going past each other here. Maneuvering on these waters and finally steering a huge ferry straight to the last centimeter into a small berth, here there is no room for romanticism or Greek mythology. Well, unless you're a passenger, in which case, be my guest. When dusk falls and thousands of muezzins start to proclaim that Allah is great, then the conversation cease and people sink into a melancholy, metaphysical mood. I often take advantage to this to ask a few random Turks, what's like living with this strait? Is anybody here interested in the daily journey between the continents? They shrug their shoulders. They don't understand what I'm asking. A strait is a strait. Only Typhoon, the poet, is it the least surprised by the question. I have a sort of strait inside me too, he says, throwing a large piece of pretzel towards the seagulls chasing the ferry. Every Turk hovers between tradition and modernity, the European Union or dislike to the European Union, the mosque or the disco, the hat or the charger. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. The narrator of the following excerpt is a glaciologist who is working on a cruise ship that takes tourists to the Antarctic Peninsula. Just 1 minute in German so that you can hear, as you already heard, how beautiful German is. And the rest will be in English. Es ist ein Tag, an dem man Berge mit Wolken und Wolken mit Berge verwechseln könnte. Alpen erheben sich inmitten des Ozeans. Und wenn die Wolkenhänge reißen, werden Gletscher und Gestein sichtbar. Darunter Hutungen, an denen sich die Rentiere verbeißen, seitdem sie von heimbekannten Norwegern eingeführt wurden. Bäume haben auf Südgeorgien noch niemals Wurzeln geschlagen. In der Bucht grünt sich das Meer ein, reich an Krill und Sauerstoff. Die Schöpfung erscheint in unvertrauter Klarheit, so als hätte man uns allen über Nacht den grauen Star entfernt. Wir laufen Grüttwicken an, eine alte Walfangstation, von einem Tag auf den anderen verlassen, auf dass sie verfalle und verrotte. Die Passagiere flanieren vom Friedhof zum Schlachthof, zum Schlammloch. Darin wälzen sich nur einige Seeelefanten, die keine Regung zeigen, außer wenn sie gähnen. A day when clouds look like mountains and mountains look like clouds. Alpine peaks spring up in the middle of the ocean. A tear in the sloping cloud bank exposes rocky cliffs and glaciers looming over patches of pasture, where reindeer introduced by homesick Norwegians chomp away at the vegetation. Trees have never set down their roots. The water inside the pot cove is rich in oxygen and krill and takes on a greenish tint. Here creation appears in unfamiliar clarity, as though all cataracts had been removed from our eyes overnight. We put in at Grytviken, an old whaling station that was abandoned from one day to the next and left to rot and ruin. The passengers stroll from the cemetery to the Flensingplan, to the mud hole where the elephant seals wallow motionless except when yawning. Our dock isn't far from the graveyard with its small but distinguished assortment of deceased. The diesel tanks are lined up as neatly as the graves. Inside the factory, humans once dismembered whales, now time is dismantling the factory. Silence weighs on the dilapidated hulls. The skuas fly in other skies. The whale oil tanks still exude a stench, or so it seems to me. It's hard to breathe in the middle of the rusting slaughter works. Here and there a roof slants downward between the clouds and the tin floor. Red signs mark off an area infested with asbestos. In front of the bone rendering plant, 3 figures clamp their hands around an iron chain and lean back as though in a tug of war with long dead whalers. But how am I to distance myself from this flensing deck, this place synonymous with death? In a good year they processed up to 40,000 whales until there were no whales left. Then the fur seals were skinned until there were no fur seals left. After that the elephant seals were killed off for their blubber, and the dry pots were heated with penguins when the fuel ran out. And when there were no more elephant seals left, the penguins were rendered into oil. Everything was put to use. Diligent humans are constantly showing nature more efficient ways to manage her resources. I tramp across a gently sloping soccer field. The crooked goalposts are a comforting sight. Slaughter by morning and soccer in the afternoon. Did the goalie's hands stink? Were the striker's shins streaked with blood? Others complain. Why do you have to be so negative? You always ruin the mood. Can't you just leave off for once? The same thing over and over, burbling around me from dawn to dusk. Don't take it seriously, relax, stop picking on everything, turn a blind eye. Things won't work out so bad, nothing's as awful as it seems. Everyone has downloaded the same downplaying software, ready to duck when the storm hits. I wonder what words would have sprung to their happy lips if they had been hauled off to the clinic at Pentecost, just as summer was setting in with a persistent pain in my chest. Translation was by Philip Böhm. I thank you for listening.
Thank you for mentioning Philip. Ilija is actually one of the things I neglected to say in my opening remarks. The names of the translators, and now I think you can know their names. Sabine Gruber, translated by Peter Lewis. Witold Szablowski by Antonia Lloyd-Jones, and again Philip Böhm translated Ilija. We also have a late entry to our readings. You may have noticed the name of 3 women in the program and only one who read. Unfortunately, neither Maria Dueñas from Spain nor Daniela Zeke-Butsura from Romania were able to come to New York. However, we do have an actor here to read a brief excerpt from the work of Daniela Zeke-Butsura, who's a graduate of the University of Bucharest, where she's a professor of philology and a lecturer in the press department of the Faculty of Journalism. She's very involved in Romanian media, and I'm not sure of the title of what you're going to be reading from, but the excerpt will be read by Florin Penișoara. Yes. Oh, thank you.
Good evening. So this is an excerpt from the fictionalized history of a safari by Daniela Zeke-Butsura. I'm going to first read in Romanian and then I'm going to read in English. Prin ochiul de pește al himenului nu treceau monede, ci doar bani ușori de hârtie. De aceea Maison Dior nu sclipea de metale și bogății, ci mânca icre negre și era iubitor de călătorii. Fusese în China și în Canare și la Sydney și în New York. Îi plăcea să navigheze pe mare și să plece la schi când în golf se topea nisipul. Nu avea urmași, căci nevasta și fiul lui muriseră de malarie într-o misiune din Kenya. De când se convertise la islamism, le spunea tuturor că băiatul lui a fost plata și pedeapsa pe care Allah i-o dăduse pentru copiii nenăscuți și pentru bărbații trași pe sfoară. dar cui să le lasă pe bietele porumbițe? Bătea 50 de ani și avea 4 slugi și o casă pustie cu arcuri de iederă și magnolii. Pe Karima o plăcuse de îndată ce apăruse în cadrul ușii. Era fără văl și el o privea exact ca motanul ce simțea laptele. De la început îi zise cu limba ei despicată: Doctore, dacă tot îmi repar năvodul pe atâția bani, să se prindă în el un rechin de aur, mă auzi? De ce un rechin, se mirase el? Păi de-aia. Cred că știu cum e cu peștii mărunți care sunt înghițiți de alții. Erau vorbe care îl dăduseră gata, o voia de nevastă, chit că avea să o fure și să o cumpere de la maică sa. Fata nu simțise nimic. Pentru ea, el era un franțuz care îi scotocise cu linguri reci prin floarea plăcerii. Când ieșea pe hol, încurcat de binelea, Maherzia îl întâmpinase să-i pună plicul în buzunar după înțelegere. Îi spuse roșind: uite ce e, nu te lua după părul meu alb. Fata asta a dumitale face cu mult mai mult și am să vin să ți-o iau. Așa că nu mă plăti. Doctore, mi-o cer de nevastă? Nu râde de mine, te rog, și vorbește încet. Dacă ai îndoieli, ți-aduc aminte că sunt musulman, dar că nu am rude în Maghreb. Am să vin cu un amic bun. Să o văd și pe asta, zise ea neîncrezătoare. Am o noră îngropată, un nepot fără toică și 2 copile de măritat. Nu mi-arde de glumă. Locuiți pe domeniul din L'Esplanade? Chiar acolo. Nimeresc eu locul, mai zise, și se duse spre ceata de femeiuști care o așteptau pe Karima. Maherzia spoke again, as she had done so once already. That time behind the blinds and next to a boiling tea kettle. Now it was her heart that was boiling, for the destiny of her daughter was at stake. Ladies, Monia has not had the time to invite you to visit. But what it was, she wanted I shall tell you even here among the dead. If I have spent money on my daughter-in-law, then let Allah watch over her sleep, because my daughter is going to cost me even more to rid her of her shame. What shame? Asked Dariel. What's wrong with Karima? Never mind, she won't die. They just need to sew her hymen back. It's not quite like that, mother. They have to reconstruct it, interposed Monia. But the old woman interrupted her sharply. What do I care whether it's called one thing or another? The misfortune is the same, and as for you, all of you, you ought to have your mouths sewn up. You won't marry well if you've been bad and desire to dally beforehand. What does it all mean? Said Gustav from behind him, open-mouthed, taking an interest. Go away, said Eglantine, stamping her foot. Good Lord, maybe he'll tell her father what we've been talking about. The circle of women dispersed, and each went home. Only Dariel stayed for a little while longer, and of course, Raime, who had the earth above her. Finally, she saw Dariel sprinkling something over the grave. What are you sowing? Seeds. They're lavender seeds. Karima was dodged by misfortune. The very gynecologist who was to sew her hymen fell in love with her. She was with her sister and a gaggle of women who cackled in the corridor until the operation was over. Anyone else want a hymenoplasty? I have children too, said Eglantine. I'm hardly the Virgin Mary. What about me? What good would it do? Laughed Dariel. My lover has known for quite some time that I'm not a virgin, doctor. Doctor, you should buy yourself a carriage with all that money. A carriage? Why? When I came to Maghreb, I'd barely left the airport when I let myself be bewitched by the allurements of a coachman. He drove me under the orange trees and through La Goulette. He took me up onto the cornice, and everything I saw was a fairy tale. I think that with my hymen, it was the same. No, you're not being fair. I, who was born in Paris and practiced in the 14th arrondissement, want to die under the olive trees in Tunis and under the cedars. Let no one ask me why, for that I cannot say. The doctor, as usual, was flirting as he chatted with the women. He was so familiar to the daughters, mothers, girlfriends, and mistresses
that none of them any longer thought to hide their secrets. His name seemed predestined, Olivier Maisondieu. And it might be thought that it was the very grace of God toward the sinning women who had tasted of the apple without commencing with their husbands. Through the fisheye of the hymen passed no coins but lighter money, made of paper, and this is why Maisondieu did not gleam with medals and riches, but rather he ate caviar and loved to travel. He had been to China, the Canary Isles, Sydney, and New York. He liked to go sailing and skiing. He had no descendants, for his wife and son had died of malaria during a posting to Kenya. Ever since he converted to Islam, he told everyone that his son had been the payment and the punishment Allah had given him for unborn children and for husbands who had had the wool pulled over their eyes. But to whom was he to abandon the poor little doves? He was approaching the age of 50, and he had 4 servants and an empty house with arches of ivy and magnolias.